Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Steve Cohen, and I'm Senior Dean of the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University and a professor in the practice of public affairs at the School of International and Public Affairs. I also run a few master's programs in environment and sustainability. It is my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker and author of The Power of Deserts, Climate Change, Middle East, and the Promise of a Post-Oil Era, my colleague and friend, Professor Dan Rabinowitz. Dan is a professor of sociology and anthropology at Tel Aviv University and was head of Tel Aviv University's Porter School of Environmental Studies and chairman of Greenpeace Mediterranean. He received the Pratt Prize for Environmental Journalism in 2012 and the Green Globe Award for Environmental Leadership in 2016. Professor Rabinowitz has written an important and provocative work detailing how the Middle East and North African nations are likely to be devastated by the impacts of climate change, and that even though the oil-producing kingdoms benefit from the sale of fossil fuels, they could also generate huge amounts of renewable energy. Professor Rabinowitz skillfully communicates the difficulty these nations will face in adapting to climate change. The book surveys regional climate models and identifies the potential impact on socioeconomic disparities, population movement, and political instability. It also envisions a brighter future with renewable energy and investigates potential opportunities arising from a looming crisis. Today, we'll examine this new work, and to do that, we have a panel discussion on the role of oil-rich countries in the Persian Gulf in leading the global transition to renewable energy. In addition to Professor Rabinowitz, the panelists include Dr. Yochanan Kushnir, a climate scientist, and my colleague from Columbia University's Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, a part of the Earth Institute, and my colleague, Professor Sara, Tjossem, an environmental historian from the School of International and Public Affairs, who is also the Associate Director of the MPA program in Environmental Science and Policy. We'll begin our discussion with a summary of the new book by Professor Rabinowitz. Dan, take it away.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this introduction and also for being so instrumental in organizing today's event. Thanks, Sara and Yochanan, also for joining, and everybody else for attending. I'm really happy to be here. This is part of a longer association that I've had with Columbia University, SIPA, Earth Institute. So I am already feeling at home, even though I'm speaking from my office at Tel Aviv University. Let me share this with you and say that the book actually begins with a review of climate predictions for the region, which suggests that the Middle East, which is already hotter and drier than most parts, will soon see even harsher conditions. It also looks at inequalities in the region. It analyzes climate inequalities between states and within states, both in terms of responsibility for the climate crisis due to differentiated greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of adaptation and vulnerability gaps, and also touches on the differentiated willingness of various countries in the region to contribute to the global effort to curb climate change. In this respect, the Middle East is not quantitatively or qualitatively different than other parts, because these inequalities are everywhere, but they are particularly harsh in the Middle East. So that's a second topic, if you like, and looks at the perils and in adaptation. It also looks and examines the connections between global warming, agricultural decline, food insecurity, and migration and conflict, which have inflicted parts of the Middle East before, and looks at the possibility that things that we've seen in Sudan and Syria might become the new normal. And it highlights, of course, how droughts can force peasants to leave their land, and food shortages sometimes can translate to famine, instability, and conflict. So to summarize these three issues, which I'm not going to talk about in my opening remarks, the book looks at climate predictions for the Middle East, it looks at climate inequalities, and it looks at the nexus to food insecurity and conflict. And I'm happy to go back to these issues in the Q&A. But for the rest of my opening remarks, I really want to dedicate to the argument which comes in the latter part of the book. And in a nutshell, it claims that three things, really. One is that the global energy transition has already begun from fossil fuels to renewables. This will not come as a surprise to you. Second, it comes too late and is progressing too slowly, and we might be losing the race against time to curb climate change. But then comes the twist, because from my analysis of the situation in the Middle East, especially in the Persian Gulf, I suggest in the book that the oil-rich kingdoms in the area are uniquely positioned to accelerate this transition. This is not due to some ideational or ideological transformation. I'm arguing that the urge to survive the transition to the post-oil era could be enough to push them in this admittedly counterintuitive direction of suddenly adopting renewables and leaving fossil fuels behind. So let me walk you through this particular part of the book, which is, as I say, the final part and the main argument. So the energy transition has begun. If you look at demand for oil, for example, and this breakdown shows us the main sectors. Obviously, road transportation up there is the most important source of demand for oil globally, but there are other things that other branches that you can see, or sectors you can see here. And we know what's happening to road transportation. It's going there, and it's going there, and it's even going there. And we know that within a decade, you won't be allowed to distribute cars that are internal combustion cars in many countries in Europe. By 2025, most car producers will have major models of either hybrid or electric cars. It's happening in aviation and heavy industry also, although in a slower rate. But they are also sort of weaning themselves and will be doing that in the next decade or two from fossil fuels. So in a decade or two, demand for oil could really be going down very significantly. Meantime, we have a second shift, which is electricity production, power. And the renewables revolution is happening there with force. Solar in particular is in place to grow faster in the coming decades than other types of renewable energy. And this is, of course, relevant mainly for natural gas, but also and for coal, but it also has an impact on the universe of oil. It's happening, you can see it in this graph, which shows the amount of, or the proportion of energy, of electricity now being produced from renewables by European countries. And you can see that they're all at least in the 20%, some of them much higher. These are projections for mid-century by International Renewable Energy Agency that shows the one scenario by which by 2050, up to 65% of total energy consumed will come from renewables. So we're getting there, and we're getting there mainly by virtue of this, if you like, economic revolution that has been happening in the last decade. Particularly look at how the costs of producing power from solar, from photovoltaic solar panels has gone down so dramatically, from $359 per megawatt about 10 years ago to under 20 in the lower right corner of this graph currently. So this has been happening, and of course will have far-reaching implications on greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at the percentage, electricity and heat, 43% of greenhouse gas emissions in 2016, and combine it with transport, 22%. And if transport is going electric, and if electricity is going renewables, so we are looking at by mid-century for a good cut also in greenhouse gas emissions. So up to here, good news, but is this energy transitioning happening fast enough? Well, obviously it isn't. As I said, we started late and we are progressing too slowly. I won't go into the reasons here, but I will only mention that there is a very robust regime of carbon subsidies that has different forms and different faces from country to country, but it sort of arrests this transition significantly. And this is why the fossil fuels universe is still with us. This is where I want to turn to the Persian Gulf, and mainly to these 6 countries. I call them the 6 kingdoms by the Gulf. Saudi Arabia is the important, largest, and most influential amongst them, but Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Oman are also part of this formation called the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, formed in the 1980s for better cooperation between them, and also has become one of the pillars of OPEC, and then OPEC Plus as well. This group of countries, not very large, all told there are no more than 30 or 40 million people. They account for 28% of global oil exports. And they also account, you can see that on the right-hand side where it says GCC, for almost 30% of oil reserves. This, of course, has given them immense prosperity in the last 50 or 60 years when oil has been selling for high prices and creating the revenues that has been translated to a very lavish lifestyle and high prosperity. Look at the average annual GDP growth of the 6 countries of the GCC between the 1990s and 2016, always averaging for the whole period around 7 to 8, sometimes 12% in the case of Qatar. If you want to see how fast these economies grew, look at the 2 green bars at the bottom. Between 1973, which is when oil became more expensive because of the first oil crisis, United Arab Emirates economy grew almost 140 fold. Saudi Arabia 50 times. The US and Germany grew slower in the same period. But there's trouble now. If you look into the future for these countries, the future looks much more problematic. One looming peril we've already mentioned. There is a slowing demand in oil, and the end of the oil era is already on the horizon. And there is a danger for these countries that they could find themselves in the same position that the salt tycoons of Europe found themselves in the 19th century, when salt grew from being a very sought after commodity that was essential for food preparation, food preservation. And then with refrigeration, the food industry was completely transformed. And if you owned a salt mine like the one you see here, which is now a museum in Austria, you were suddenly left with very little in your hands. So when we look at large oil producing countries, and especially those who are dependent on oil, you're actually looking at a future that could look like the past of the oil tycoons that became very insignificant after the 19th century. The second problem, of course, is climate. And what we see here is the Middle East, according to the severity of its climate models. And we're looking at a particular part of the Middle East, which, because of a particular geography that I will not go into, is already hotter and drier than most places on Earth. And is really looking at a future whereby by mid-century or a bit later, some of the mega cities that have become so famous in this area, like Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Haran and Maname, Kuwait City, could be uninhabitable. But there is a silver lining, and that is, and that's where sort of my argument comes full circle, because they have another resource which they could tap into, and that's solar irradiation. So that we're talking also about one of the places that is richest on the planet in terms of solar energy. Lots of sunshine days a year and a very high level of solar irradiation per hour that reaches the surface. The area also has abundance of unproductive land because of lack of water, and which could be used and is already being used, as you can see on the left, for large solar fields. There is a lot of available capital, and there is also a good record of incorporating innovation into civil infrastructure in the GCC6. So, given all this, the double trouble looking to the future, post-oil is looming. Very dire climate predictions, and a very good potential for developing solar energy. Could the GCC6 help accelerate the global energy transition? And this is where my argument becomes a little surprising and counterintuitive. And in the book, I actually say that they've already started. They have already been declaring for 15 years that this is what they want to do. And there are some very impressive beginnings of very large solar panel and photovoltaic fields, mainly in the United Arab Emirates. And looking to the future, this is my sort of blueprint, if you like, for a smooth transition on their part to the post-oil era. They could accelerate their own transition to renewables, which they've been declaring they want to do and actually started doing, mainly the United Arab Emirates. The others are lagging behind. Second, they could invest heavily in renewable capacity and technology abroad. Take some of the capital accumulated during the oil era and invest it, if you like, in the future, moving away from an industry that is about to collapse on them due to falling demand. And third, pick the moment, maybe 5 or 10 years on, when their share of the global renewables market will have become meaningful, to willfully shut off oil and gas production altogether on their home turf. This will nudge the price of oil a bit higher because 30% will be taken away from the market, and will clinch the supremacy of renewables over fossil fuels, finally clinch it, and will allow them to sort of make a profit on their earlier investment. So this, if you like, is the blueprint that I develop in the book for how they might deal with this dual problem that is approaching for them. Will they do it? I doubt it, but I also think that or will they do it immediately? It's an uphill climb in terms of leadership, in terms of vision. There's no real reason, I think, for them not to do it, but also I can appreciate that this is a very major transition. They would have to sort of move away from a golden opportunity they've had with oil into the brave new world of renewables. But I also think that their pathways and their options for the future are getting narrower. I think I'll stop here with this argument and bring it back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Dan. A really interesting argument, and I'm looking forward to our discussion, perhaps about how we might make it real. So we will start with Professor Tjossem, our environmental historian here. And Sarah, if you could give us some of your comments, I would appreciate it.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve. And particularly thanks to you, Professor Rabinowitz. I'm a historian of science, and I focus on the natural world particularly, and the policies that we deploy. And so in that area, I have focused on intergovernmental cooperation. So this book has been particularly of interest for several reasons, partly because underlying it is this question about the extent of cooperation, collaboration, and also this playing out of scenarios for the future. And for those of you who have a whole bookshelf of unread books, I can assure you it's readably short and really engaging. So it's rich with ideas and intersections. So thank you again, Professor Rabinowitz, for that whirlwind tour, where you present, in essence, climate change as what has been called a threats multiplier. It's already exacerbating food and water shortages, compromising livelihoods, aggravating social inequalities, and driving displacement and political instability across the world, but particularly in the Middle East. And you call for a climate just future. You characterize in your book this time as being post-denial and pre-final despair phase. I like that assessment because it combines both the gravity of the situation, but also this opportunity for transition from a reliance on fossil fuels to renewable energy. And as you point out, the idea of a massive deployment of solar panels in desert areas is scientifically and technologically possible. It's also economically viable and growing more so every day, every year as well. And so it's a pathway to possibly less carbon intensive future. You've managed to deftly make such complexity of the underlying climate modeling approachable, but also for many of us, the geopolitics of the region and of Gulf oil production as well. So in the field of history of science, one of the central concerns is about the deep appeal to technological fixes. It's really exciting to think that we can solve problems, for instance, energy poverty, through something like renewables. And if we can do that without fundamental changes in consumption patterns, people are often on board with that. And so solar and wind are often promoted as such technological fixes. So in your book, I really appreciate how you try to tackle more than the technology, asking about the political climate, the alliances necessary to come up with a robust climate future. And you're particularly concerned with the many communities and people who are energy insecure. So the consumption is driven by a very small percent of the people. And so your central question, could the trade and security bloc of the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council states, the GCC, emerge as leaders on climate action? I appreciate that question because so many people have not asked it. One thing I would like to hear more about when we open up to the Q&A session is whether solar and wind should be seen even themselves as a stopgap measure, where the long-term goal should be to reduce that consumption, those patterns of consumption that you showed in your slides and you talk about in your book, so that subsequent generations don't have the massive income and consumption inequality that we have now. So it is one of the interesting questions I had was about this term unproductive land, which you used in your slides, and you do in your book as well. And in fact, many people think of deserts as being unproductive, that they're just waiting for some sort of human utility. And I would have loved to see and would love to hear from you more about the underlying environment of the desert and whether there's a way to bring this vision for renewable energy into greater conversation with the concern about global biodiversity loss that we've had. And I think about all of those really neat desert animals like the Arabian wolf or the fennec or the hyena. There aren't many out there, but there are some really interesting opportunities for collaboration between the technology of solar, the technology of wind, and biodiversity. And so I just wanted to raise this idea of cross-boundary cooperation, whether it is geographical boundaries or agency boundaries. And I take heart in an example from the United States of the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, which is an ambitious attempt to think about biodiversity, think about our natural world at the same time as we strive for this energy future. So that was one area that was very interesting to me. And then the second thing that came to mind, which I think would be very interesting to explore, is the role of nuclear power. There's a huge disagreement among environmentalists and countries about the role that that would play in an energy secure future. So I'm going to leave it at that for my part, and maybe I'll have a chance to ask you questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. One of the interesting issues of working in this field of sustainability and environment is that we require a lot of different disciplines: sociology, anthropology, history, law, political science, engineering, and even something called climate science and modeling, which is what Professor Kushnir will be sharing with us. It's always a little dangerous to be working in somebody else's area, but in our field, because you simply can't do this work without crossing disciplinary boundaries. So I would be very interested in hearing from Yochanan on his assessment of how well Dan did on his climate science. And so, Yochanan, if you'll unmute yourself and give us your comments, it'd be great.
So yeah, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Dan, for writing this fantastic book that brings into light a place that just a few years ago was brought into light because of the situation in Syria, which Dan dedicates a large discussion to. And I would say that Dan describes very well the outlook regarding climate change in the Middle East. The predictions, about the distribution of rainfall and the reduction in rainfall, water resources that come from groundwater and so on. So all this is very well described, including also, as I mentioned a minute ago, what brought the situation to a really tragic case in Syria, both because of climate, and Dan raises also the question whether climate can be seen as the cause or just a multiplier of other causes that existed in Syria at the time. Of course, climate alone doesn't create all the problems, and it's not the only cause for what's happening in different parts of the world, in particularly the Middle East. And before I just say something about why we see the Middle East as a hotspot, the Mediterranean in general and the Middle East in it, I would say that the Middle East always experienced periods of extended droughts. I mean, we usually call a drought something that happens in 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, but these are what scientists nowadays call mega droughts, long periods in which the region was very dry and the water resources were very limited. So it's an area which is prone to have droughts. And of course, it's an area where there are large deserts also, the extension of the Sahara Desert. So why is this area so sensitive? Why is it called a hotspot? And today there is almost a unanimous agreement between climate scientists that the Mediterranean in general and the Middle East in it is a particular in a particular dire spot for the effect of climate change. And that just as a general, very quick description of what is happening in the Middle East is that we have an area that is fed by rain during wintertime, except for the very southern extremities of the region over Yemen, southern Saudi Arabia, and the area in the Middle East which boundaries on the Arabian Sea, where we get summer rain because of the extension of the African summer monsoon. But in most of the Middle East, we get rain in winter only. And the rain is a result of storms that travel along the Mediterranean Sea and draw the moisture out of that sea and then dump it over the land that surrounds the Mediterranean Sea. That's the case everywhere almost in the Mediterranean. And once you generate a global mechanism, and it's certainly global events that cause the changes in the Middle East, once you generate an event which causes a reduction of these storms, you get into a problem in terms of the amount of rainfall that falls down in the winter. And this is what's happening with climate change. Why is that exactly? Well, I would tell you right now that one of the projects that we are running in the climate group at Lamont with my colleague Richard Seeger and other people is that we are asking the big question of why that is so acute in the Middle East. And I'm sorry, somebody is knocking at my door. That's the problem with working from home. Anyway, we are just asking this question, and we don't have a real easy solution for why that is. So this is one of the pertinent questions about why about climate change in general. So what we are facing in the future is a reduction of these storms and the reduction of the rainfall in the Middle East, which at the end of the 21st century, we expect it to be something around 10 to 15% over the region. One interesting thing about the reduction of rainfall, of course, it doesn't rain much today in the desert anyway, but we have an area which is in historical terms is called the Fertile Crescent, which is the range of mountains that wrap up the Middle East region from the northern side, where the mountainous area is getting more rain, and this way it feeds the rivers, especially the Euphrates and the Tigris River that feed a large part of Iraq. I'm sorry, so this area feeds the resources of the Middle East from the north, and in the same way the mountains in Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and across the Dead Sea Rift in Jordan, these areas also have mountainous regions, and they are also an area where rainfall falls, and then it feeds like the Jordan River and the water resources that eventually reach several other countries in the Middle East. So those are the areas which catch the storms and feed the rainfall, and those are the areas which see in the future a reduction of up to 15% in rainfall. So again, thank you, Dan, for putting together this book, which puts a vision of how we can actually activate the region as in response to this global threat, one of the global threats, or maybe the global threat that faces the entire world in the 21st century. So thank you.
Thank you, Yochanan. So, and feel free to get the door if you need to.
I'll just go for a minute to see what these people want.
Okay. So I think what I'd like to do is let me make a couple of brief comments and then ask Dan to respond. Well, first, on the nuclear issue, my perspective on it, and Sarah's probably heard me say this before, I always like to quote Barry Commoner when he used to talk about nuclear power. He said it's a hell of a complicated way to boil water. And It's one of my favorite comments of his. The second is actually on the politics, and I will ask you think about to respond on the politics. So you have you had in the United States an early version of a climate catastrophe. We called it the Dust Bowl, where the middle part of our country lost productive soil and was one of the contributors to the Great Depression. And then at the end of, and in response to that, we had the election of President Franklin Roosevelt, who did things like the Civilian Conservation Corps and spent a great deal of money to try to restore the soil in the middle of the country. In contrast to that, in Syria, you had Assad, who is arguably a homicidal maniac. So you have the leadership of one of America's greatest presidents, and you have the leadership of perhaps one of the worst leaders we've seen in quite a few years, although there's always the American president to think of. But in any case, Dan, your response to the comments of the commenters and the brief points I've just made. Love to hear them.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Sara and Yochanan, for your thoughtful remarks. Lots to grapple with. I'm with you, Sara, about treating renewables as really a stopgap during crisis, en route to a better and brighter future of slower consumption. I think this vision is not only something that we can all agree with. It's also something that I've been sort of part of it and part of advocating it since throughout my career, both as an environmental activist but also in my writing. The problem about this vision is that the pace by which we can hope to get there eventually is not dramatic enough. The need to change people's hearts, change people's habits, and maybe most importantly, to change the economic realities and the structure of power that is associated with this consumption and this way of life, is something that is at odds with the pace by which the climate crisis is encroaching. And this is why the need for this transition period in which consumption will hopefully go down, but probably not quickly enough to anticipate and to keep climate change at bay. So my heart is with this. My mind tells me that waiting for this to happen, and even doing our best efforts to this for this to happen, is not cutting it so far. And therefore and timing is really so important here, because this decade and the following, between now and 2040, I think would really be the 20-year period that will seal our fate, both as a civilization, but more particularly for particular populations, the ones who find themselves in harsher conditions and are also poorer and less able to protect themselves. The metaphor I like about this, the transition that is happening but is not happening fast enough, is a train that has left the station and is going in the right direction. However, it is winding up a mountain and is going very slow, and it's going through the woods, and suddenly the passengers and the engine drivers see that there is a forest fire that is chasing the train. So will the train get to the pass and glide to the other side and move away from the inferno in time? This is the kind of situation that we find ourselves. And yes, a lot of the current discussion in the climate universe, and I think the discussion that you bring as well, is how do we manage these crucial few decades that are unfolding now. I think the question about unproductive land is again one which I can identify very strongly with. I spent 4 years in my youth as a field study center instructor in the Sinai Desert, and I still see the Sinai with its natural environment as my second home. And global biodiversity and this technology versus conservation duality is very much and should very much be part of our consciousness. I'm sure that there are ways to the desert tech, the famous desert tech initiative from the early 2000s about running Europe on power that is generated in the Sahara was only talking about 10% of the Sahara being used for these giant photovoltaic. So I think that these two can be reconciled, and I'm not really envisaging the whole of the Arabian Peninsula being covered by photovoltaic. There's also no need for that. I'll come back to nuclear power when I get to Steve's point. To Yochanan's point, yes, I think that what we've seen in Syria is really the devastation of Syria is really an excellent case in terms, not excellent in terms of what happened, but really a laboratory case in which 5 or 6 years of very deep drought and a prolonged drought, as Yochanan was saying, combined with ethnic strife, with weak government, with corruption, with this debilitating gaps between the metropole in Damascus and the hinterland, has really taken its toll. The problem is that many countries in the Middle East have maybe not all of these circumstances, but at least some of them. So there's a real danger that what we saw in Syria and to an extent in Sudan could become the new normal. Also, I think it's important to mention, and Yochanan mentioned it, the Middle East is not uniform in terms of what climate predictions are predicting for it. And in fact, in the southern part, nearer to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, we might even see an increase in rainfall. The tragedy is that even if we see a 25% increase in rainfall in the south, it will the current level of precipitation is so low. It's around 85 or 90 millimeters a year, but even a 25% rise will not get it over the all-important 200 millimeter per year threshold and will not really change productivity very dramatically. In the north, on the other hand, where current levels are at 300 and 400, if you are looking at a 40 or 50% decrease of rainfall, as Yochanan mentioned, you could well go under the all-important 200 millimeter threshold, which is so important for agriculture. So these are very, very important points. Nuclear, I am not sure it is very relevant for the region. It is, of course, relevant when we're looking at warfare and nuclear in terms of weaponry, Israel, Iran. But I do not see nuclear power coming into the Middle East, mainly because of the costs. So I think that the danger, if you like, of the Middle East going nuclear has never been, and going nuclear in terms of energy, of course, has never been very substantial, and it's now even more remote because of this. Of the revolution in costs of renewables. The dust bowl analogy, I think, is very apt, Steve. And I think that when we look at, in the US in the late 20s and early 30s, and when we look at the Middle East of, Syria 10 years ago, or Sudan even for the last 20 years, there is one thing in common, and that is that peasants are very, very sharp in their understanding of how the natural environment around them is changing. And they often do not need climate scientists to come with powerful models and predictions to realize that their livelihood is in danger. And the immediate consequence of that is what we saw in the southwestern United States, in the Midwest also in the 1920s and 30s, and what we saw also in Syria and Sudan. People leave. And once they leave their agricultural plots and their communities, and a number of things are sort of kick into gear. One is that if you do not cultivate land in a desert area, it becomes even more susceptible to wind erosion and deterioration. And the other thing is that it creates very, very deep social and political problems. Some of them we saw in the United States in the Dust Bowl. In the Middle East, the road towards state dysfunction and deterioration into conflict and refugeedom was what we happened. And of course, the differences in leadership, FDR versus various Middle Eastern leaderships is stark. But I think that there are studies, and I quote in the book a very major study that was done by the World Bank about how peasants already in Egypt, in Morocco, in other parts of North Africa, in Yemen, are looking to the future with impressive clarity about what is in store for them as farmers, and are planning an exit towards the nearest town or city. So this is something that is already happening, and it's accelerating.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages the United States had during the Dust Bowl is people could leave from the middle of the country to the west. In fact, the settling of California largely took place because of the Dust Bowl. But let me turn to one more question from me, and then we'll get some of our audience questions, and then at the very end, I think I'm going to ask each of our panelists for a final word before giving you the absolute final word. So my question really is, we have seen some recent diplomatic movement in the Middle East since you've published your book, recognition of Israel by a few of the countries that you're describing. Is there some possibility that the European Union or the United States, Israel itself, might be able to play some role in this transition? Are there any steps that could be taken over the next 5 or 10 years to accelerate this process? What are your thoughts on that, Dan?
Well, thanks for this question. It's really very a timely question. When I was writing the book, and it went to print in June, it was before this rapprochement between Israel and the UAE, and I didn't really see a particular angle in the book about Israel and its part in the Middle East, even though I am Israeli. But obviously the changes that have taken place over the last few months are begging and raising your question. I think that if the leaders of the GCC were to consider sort of being more proactive about this transition to post-oil, partly by becoming more into renewables, then the new relationship with Israel could help. I don't think it hinges on it, and it could help not necessarily in the field of technology. I know that Israel is seen by many as a hub for innovation and technology, which it is, but I don't think the GCC need Israel for technology in the realm of renewables. Maybe on storage, But the new breakthroughs in technology could come from Israel and could come from elsewhere. There's one area in which Israeli expertise could sort of dovetail with capital and willingness to invest on the part of the Gulf states, and that is that Israel has really become quite made a lot of progress with solar energy in the last 10 years without building any major solar fields. So what Israel has done is to encourage smallholders, small farmers who may have a cowshed or a chicken growing homes and other structures to invest in renewables, small scale, and was very clever in offering them a deal to sell it to the main grid. This, I think, could be this type of know-how expertise could really be very useful in third world countries, in poor countries, who sometimes lack the capital to make great investments in renewables, but could make inroads into this new industry by encouraging smallholders to become sort of contributors, sometimes prosumers, producers who are also consumers. So I think that in that respect, there is a prospect for collaboration between Israel and the UAE and others. Am I impressed with what's happening so far in terms of energy? No, Steve. And I'm quite disappointed because the first discussions that are actually going on now between Israel and the UAE about energy is that Israel would have oil from the Gulf running through a pipeline that has been there since the days of the Iranian Shah in the 1970s, when Israel was the main conduit for oil coming in big ships from Iran to Eilat and then crossing the Negev in this pipeline, which has been quite redundant for the last 20 or 30 years. So now they're talking about resurrecting it and moving UAE oil that arrives in Eilat and then goes to Europe. A bit of an outdated project at a time when Europe is weaning itself from oil, but sort of a kind of a knee-jerk response to this new relationship that leadership on both sides. I'm hoping to sort of make inroads into other types of thoughts about energy collaboration that move away from fossil fuels rather than encourage it.
We'll have to send copies of your book to some of the leadership of these countries, get them to think about this. So Stephanie Hoy, who is the Chief Administrative Director of our Environmental Science and Policy Program, and actually a graduate of the Sustainability Management Program, has been fielding Q&A questions. So I don't know what we have so far, Stephanie, but if you want to pose one to Dan, please do.
Sure, we have a question from Bill. He asks, please address H2. The Middle East could well export ammonia through green H2 production. This could be extremely relevant as the largest electrolyzer project in history will begin to be constructed in Saudi next year.
Interesting suggestion, completely beyond my field of expertise. I promise to look into it, and if I have any comment, I will come back, and I invite my other colleagues to give us their point on their point of view on ammonia from the Middle East.
Sara, you look like you've unmuted. Do you have a comment on this?
I unmuted, but I have no comment. I don't know enough about it.
All right, Stephanie, why don't we move to this? I think I saw a second question.
Yeah, we have one more question. How can parties be held accountable to the alliances required to carry out the shift towards renewables?
Well, isn't this the question that the environmental movement has been asking itself for the last 30 or 40 years? I think that I actually have another slide that sort of addresses this, or addresses this issue. That let me move to it very quickly. This is the slide that I sometimes end my talk with. So what we see here is really, if you like, the two pathways to climate redemption that are available to us. And obviously the question that as it has just been posed looks at the pathway that is mostly associated with the Greta Thunberg and really represents what the environmental movement has been trying to do for decades now. Making leaders accountable for their willingness and for their zest in pushing this crucial transformation. And I think that, again, at heart, I'm assuming that many of us are, full subscribers to this pathway, which basically says we need to know the science. We need to understand the implications for the future if we understand climate science. We need to diligently convince large parts of the population and get leaders on board by making them accountable to doing the right things about preventing climate chaos. And if we do that, we will eventually sort of force them to do the thing that they've been trying to avoid for decades, which is to force the big corporations and consumers to move away from fossil fuels. So this, if you like, is the Greta Thunberg avenue. And this is where the question really belongs. How can we make it work? My problem with this pathway is that, committed as I am to it, and I've been to it. Steve mentioned that I was chairman of Greenpeace Mediterranean. I think that it's not getting us the results quickly enough, and that this time frame that we are in and the race against time might be getting the better of us. So the other option, represented here by MBS, but it could be any other of the leaders of the GCC6, is really, are we prepared to pursue an alternative way to climate redemption, which will not necessarily be based on understanding science, embracing the ideational pathway of environmentalism, but rather be based on people who are already very privileged and are already very rich, trying to carve themselves a niche into a world that is changing very quickly. So I'm sort of using the question about making leaders accountable to put this moral and ideological duality or the dual pathway before you. It's something that I've been thinking while writing the book, and also now in the discussions that I'm having during this virtual book tour. So I think I leave it here.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So Sara and Yochanan, before we call an end to our event here, any final comments for Dan or for the audience about this new work?
I guess the thing that occurs to me most is this idea of investing in collaboration and cooperation. And at the end of your book, you talk about the destabilization of, for instance, OPEC. And yet sometimes those breaking apart of longstanding relationships can sometimes produce opportunities. And so not that I expect that we will just cross our fingers and hope, but I think that a multifaceted approach of building those networks of cooperation can take advantage of instability as well as the occasions of stability.
Thank you, Sara.
Thank you.
Yeah, as I said before, I mean, the book lays out an opportunity to use the crisis in order to create not only solution for energy, but also a different Middle East. And some people or many people know that in the history of the Middle East, it all started with some vision of a bigger Middle East that has, sorry. that has this kind of collaboration. You know, before when the Jewish mandate in Palestine started, there was a discussion between the leaders of Saudi Arabia at the time and the leaders of the Jewish group or the Jewish entity in Israel to create some sort of a vision for the Middle East. So then lays out another opportunity of doing something like that. And maybe with the right leadership and with pushing or being pushed by the crisis of climate change, this can happen. So I do certainly hope so.
Thank you. So Dan, we're at the end of our hour. I'd like to give you the last word. What quick conclusion would you like to offer?
Following on from both of Sarah's and Yochanan's final comments, I will say that I have already been accused in this book of being an optimist about climate change, which is really normally seen as an oxymoron. But I like it. I like sort of bringing up this opportunity that could really lead in new directions, and let's hope and see what the future brings us. Maybe nearer to the vision that Yochanan has just resurrected from the 1930s, and maybe the 2030s would come full circle.
Well, thank you, Dan. And thank you, Sara and Yochanan and Stephanie and two people that helped put this together, Phoebe in particular. So again, I want to thank you for participating. I think this book is really interesting and I recommend it to all. And so with that, I will call an end to our very interesting discussion of this very interesting book. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks, Yochanan. Thanks, Sara. Thanks, everyone.